The morning Martha Lockhart sewed the last name into the last coat. Her hands were trembling so badly that the needle pricked her finger 3 times, and she did not stop once to tend the blood. It was the autumn of 1873, and the wind off the Kansas plains had a bite to it that made the drafty walls of the boarding house in Abilene groan like an old man settling into a chair. Martha sat near the single candle on the table, bent low over the small brown wool coat that belonged to her youngest, 4-year-old Clara. The letters were not fancy. Martha had no gift for embroidery, no silk thread or fine needles. She had cotton thread, a basic needle she'd sharpened on the stone ledge of the windowsill, and a stubborn determination that had seen her through worse things than a difficult stitch. Inside the collar of Clara's coat, in careful block letters, she wrote, CLARANNLOCKHART, and below that in smaller letters still, Mother is MARTHALOCKHART. Destination, Reed Ranch, Colton Creek, Texas. She folded the coat over her arm and looked across the small room at her 3 sleeping children. Clara, her baby, curled in the middle of the narrow bed with her thumb near her mouth, though she had mostly stopped the habit. 8-year-old Samuel on one side, his brown hair falling over his forehead, one boot still on because he had been too tired to remove it, and Martha had not had the heart to wake him. And 10-year-old Eliza on the other side, her arms stretched protectively over her little sister even in sleep, her dark hair fanned out on the pillow like something that belonged in a painting. Martha's throat tightened. She reached up and pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum where the ache lived, that particular grief she had carried since February when Daniel Lockhart had coughed his last breath in a room not much larger than this one, 3 towns east. He had been 34 years old, strong as an oak his whole life, and then the fever had come and taken him in 11 days, leaving Martha with $23, 3 children, and a world that had very little patience for women in her situation. She went back to the table and picked up the coat belonging to Samuel. She had already sewn his name inside the collar during the afternoon while Clara napped. She checked it now with her fingers the way a blind woman might read. Samuel James Lockhart. She did the same for Eliza's coat. Eliza Ruth Lockhart, all 3 of them named. All 3 of them carrying their identities stitched against their skin, where no amount of chaos or distance or catastrophe could take it from them. Because Martha had learned something from the last 8 months of surviving on almost nothing in a landscape that was neither cruel nor kind, simply indifferent. She had learned that the world could scatter you. A flood could take your wagon. A sickness could take your husband. A dust storm could separate a mother from her children for terrifying minutes that felt like years. And she needed to know, if anything happened to her, that someone would find her children and know their names. She set the 3 coats on the chair by the door and blew out the candle. She did not sleep. By 5 in the morning she was dressed, her own coat buttoned, her single carpetbag packed with everything she owned in the world. 2 dresses, a change of underclothes for each of the children, Daniel's pocket watch, a daguerreotype of their wedding day, 22 letters tied with kitchen string, and a folded square of paper that she had read so many times the crease marks had worn clean through in 2 places. That paper was what had set all of this in motion. It had come through the Women's Placement Bureau in Abilene 6 weeks ago, and Martha had gone to the office 3 separate times before she had the courage to actually go inside. The Bureau helped women in difficult circumstances find domestic situations in the expanding territories, housekeepers, cooks, laundresses for hotel establishments, and occasionally, for widows with children, something more permanent. The woman who ran the Bureau was named Mrs. Addie Crane, a stout widow herself of 50-some years, with gray-streaked hair and the kind of straight-backed practicality that Martha found deeply reassuring. Mrs. Crane had read Martha's circumstances with a measured eye and said, "You cook." "Yes, ma'am." "You sew, keep a house, manage accounts." "Yes to all of them." "You're not afraid of hard work." Martha had almost laughed at that. "I have not been afraid of hard work a single day of my life." Mrs. Crane had studied her for a long moment and then said, "There's a rancher down in Colton Creek, Texas. A man named Stephen Reed. He runs a cattle operation about 9,000 acres. He lost his wife 4 years ago. He has written to this bureau seeking a housekeeper and has indicated willingness to consider a widow with children if the arrangement proves agreeable to both parties." She paused. "It isn't a marriage proposal, Mrs. Lockhart. It's an employment situation with possibility." Martha had taken the paper with Stephen Reed's address written on it, and she had held it for 3 days before she wrote back through the bureau. She had written plainly. She was 28 years old. She had 3 children. She was healthy, capable, and had no illusions about what frontier life required of a person. She was not looking to be a burden. She was looking for a place where her children could grow up with a roof over their heads and food in their bellies, and some manner of stability that she could not give them in Abilene on the wages she was earning sewing other people's clothes. Stephen Reed had written back in 10 days. His handwriting was plain and somewhat cramped, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a man who did not write often but chose his words with care when he did. He said the ranch house had 4 bedrooms. He said the nearest school was 6 miles by wagon, not ideal, but children had attended it. He said he had 2 ranch hands and a woman named Rosa Gutierrez who came 3 days a week to help with the cooking and cleaning, but that he needed someone more consistent. He said he understood she had children, and that did not trouble him. That did not trouble him. Martha had read those 5 words more times than she could count. He had sent enough money through the bureau for stage passage from Abilene to Denton, Texas, and from Denton, she was to take whatever local conveyance was available south to Colton Creek, where he would meet her at the trading post. The stage left at 6 in the morning. Martha woke her children gently, helped them dress, helped Clara with the buttons on her coat, and when Samuel complained about the hour and the cold and why they had to go anywhere at all, Martha put her hand on the side of his face and said, "Because there is a place waiting for us, Samuel, and it is better than this." He was 8. He put on his hat and picked up his small bag and did not complain again. The stage to Denton was 3 days, with a night stop at a way station each evening. Martha spent most of those hours with Clara on her lap, watching Texas come up from under the horizon, the flat plains giving way to rolling scrub and cedar, the sky enormous and terribly blue. Eliza read the single book she had brought, a battered copy of a collection of Aesop's fables that had belonged to Daniel, and she read pieces of it aloud to Samuel, who pretended not to be interested and was entirely interested. Clara slept and woke and slept again, and at one point looked out the window at a hawk circling high above the scrub and said, "Mama, is that our hawk?" "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "I mean, is it following us, like it knows where we're going?" Martha kissed the top of her daughter's head. "I believe it might be." In Denton, Martha found the liveryman who ran a wagon south toward Colton Creek twice a week, a leathery man of about 60 named Hatch who charged her 40 cents for herself and said the children were no charge since they weighed nothing. He had 2 other passengers, a traveling merchant with a case of dry goods and a young Mexican man who spoke little English, and spent the journey looking out the back of the wagon with an expression of quiet contentment. The road south was not much of a road. It was 2 ruts through the grass with occasional planked crossings over the smaller creek beds. The cedar thickened as they went south, the air warming even as October deepened. They arrived in Colton Creek on the afternoon of October the 14th, 1873. Colton Creek was not precisely a town. It was more the suggestion of a town, a trading post, a blacksmith, a small church, 6 or 7 houses of varying construction, and a cattle yard at the eastern edge where the smell of livestock hung in the air even at a distance. The stage stopped in front of the trading post, a low-built cedar structure with a wide covered porch. Martha climbed down from the wagon with Clara in her arms and looked around, and her heart, which had been steady through the entire journey the way hearts sometimes are when they have no choice, now began to knock unevenly against her ribs. A man was standing at the edge of the porch. She knew it was him because of the way he was standing. Not leaning, not lounging with a boot up on the rail the way half the men in Abilene seemed to stand. He was simply standing, hat in hand, watching the wagon pull up with an expression she could not quite read at this distance. He was tall, broader in the shoulders than she had pictured from his careful handwriting, with dark hair that needed a cut and a jaw that suggested he did not shave every day but had made an effort today. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two more, with the kind of weathered quality that came not from age but from years of working under an open sky. He walked toward her as she set Clara down and put her hand on Eliza's shoulder and waited. He stopped 3 feet away and looked at her, and then he looked at the children, and Martha watched his eyes move from Eliza to Samuel to Clara and back again, and she thought she saw something move across his face, not surprise exactly, more like the expression of a man who has understood something he had only half believed. "Mrs. Lockhart," he said. "Mr. Reed," she said. There was a brief silence, and then Clara, who had absolutely no patience for ceremony, pulled the front of her coat open and said, "My name is in here. My mama sewed it." Stephen Reed looked down at the 4-year-old with the unbuttoned coat and the very serious expression, and something shifted in the set of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the near thing. He crouched down to her level, and Martha watched him read the careful stitching inside Clara's collar, and his expression changed entirely. He looked up at Martha over Clara's head. There was a question in his eyes and something else, something quieter, something she did not have a name for yet. "You sewed their names into their coats," he said. "In case we got separated," Martha said, because she would not apologize for it and she would not explain more than was necessary. He nodded slowly. Then he stood and looked at all 3 children and said something that Martha had not expected, something that was perhaps the simplest and most significant thing anyone had said to her in 8 months of surviving. "I have room for all of them," he said. "Come on. Let me take your bags." The ranch was 4 miles from town along a cedar-lined track, and Stephen drove the wagon himself, with Eliza and Samuel in the back and Clara sitting between Stephen and Martha on the bench seat, because she had simply climbed up there and planted herself, and that was that. Martha kept her eyes forward for most of the ride, taking in the land, the way the cedar gave way to open pasture, the distant smudge of cattle against the hills, the long low sky of South Texas in the afternoon. She answered Stephen's careful questions about the journey, about Abilene, about whether the children had eaten recently, with equal care. He was not a man who spoke to fill silence. She noticed that. The ranch house itself was more than she had allowed herself to imagine. She had pictured something functional and bare, a man's house, the kind that had food enough but no softness to it. What she found instead was a long, low stone house with a cedar porch that ran the full front length of it, with a rocking chair at each end. There were curtains in the windows, plain white cotton ones, and a kitchen garden along the south side that had been harvested but still showed the neat rows of it. Behind the house, a barn and 2 smaller outbuildings. In the near pasture, a chestnut horse lifted her head and looked at them as they came in. "That's Cora," Stephen said to the children. "She's gentle if you approach her slow." Samuel was off the back of the wagon before it fully stopped. "Samuel," Martha said. "He's fine," Stephen said quietly, and she looked at him sideways and he said, "The fence is sound. He can't get near enough to be under her feet." She watched Samuel press himself against the fence rail and hold his hand out toward the chestnut horse, and the horse stretched her neck and sniffed his fingers, and Samuel let out a sound of pure delight that made Martha's chest ache with something that was not quite sadness and not quite joy, some country that lay between the two. Rosa Gutierrez was in the kitchen when they came inside. She was a compact woman of about 45, dark-haired with quick eyes and the manner of someone who had surveyed the situation before anyone else in the room had finished opening the door. She looked at Martha and the children with an expression that was openly assessing but not unkind, and then she said something to Stephen in Spanish and he responded and she nodded and went back to the stove. She says supper will be ready in an hour, Stephen said. What did you say? Martha asked. I said thank you. Rosa said something else without turning around. Stephen's mouth curved slightly. She says she hopes you like venison stew because that is what there is. Martha looked at Clara clinging to her hand and thought about the watery oatmeal that had been supper at the boarding house in Abilene for the past 3 weeks. We like venison stew very much, she said. Rosa turned around at that and looked at her properly for the first time, and something in her expression unlocked slightly, as if Martha had said something that satisfied a private test. The house had 4 bedrooms, just as Stephen had written. He showed her the largest of the 3 unused ones, a room with 2 narrow beds and a window that faced east. He said the children could share it, or she could take one and the children share, however she preferred. He was careful with her, Martha noticed. Careful in the way of a man who was not careless by nature, who had thought about how this would feel to someone arriving in a stranger's house with 3 small children in tow. Her own room was small and clean, with a washstand and a mirror and a quilt on the bed that had been made by someone who knew what they were doing with a needle. She stood in it alone for the first time that evening after supper, after the children were settled and Clara had been tucked in twice because she kept getting back out, and she pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and looked out at the Texas dark, which was different from Kansas dark, richer with cricket sound and the smell of cedar, and she breathed. She had arrived. They had arrived. Whatever this was, it was a beginning. The first 2 weeks on the Reed Ranch were a kind of careful negotiation, 2 people and 4 children, because in some ways Clara attached herself to Stephen with the particular ferocity of a small child who had made a decision, working out the terms of sharing a space and a life without any agreed-upon roadmap for how to do it. Martha threw herself into the house with the focused energy of a woman who needed to prove, if not to Stephen then to herself, that she was worth the arrangement. She was up before sunrise, the kitchen fire going, coffee ready, biscuits in the cast iron by the time Stephen came in from the first round of morning chores. She cleaned the house methodically, room by room, not because it was dirty. Stephen kept it reasonably ordered, but because the act of making a place clean and tidy was one of the ways she knew how to make a place hers. She organized the pantry, took inventory, rode with Stephen to the trading post in Colton Creek to go over what was needed and what could wait. He watched her do all of this with a quiet attention that she felt but did not comment on. Eliza had begun accompanying Rosa on the days she came, learning the kitchen without being asked to, which delighted Rosa and made Martha proud in a way that was also a little heartbreaking, because Eliza was too serious for 10, too old for her age, and Martha knew exactly where that had come from. Samuel spent every spare hour at the fence with Cora, and within 10 days Stephen had put him on the horse's back for the first time, leading him around the paddock with a patience that Martha watched from the kitchen window with her hands still in the biscuit dough. Clara simply followed Stephen. It was that direct. The first morning she had appeared at his elbow in the barn while he was feeding the horses and announced that she was helping. He had handed her the brush and shown her how to curry the small brown mare in the east stall, and after that it was established. Martha had apologized on the 3rd day. She's not usually so, she will learn to give you space. Stephen had looked at her with a slightly puzzled expression. I don't want her to give me space, he said. She's good company. Martha had not known what to do with that, so she had gone back into the kitchen and stood for a moment with her hands pressed flat on the table, collecting herself. She learned him in small pieces, the way you learn a landscape by walking it over many days rather than all at once. She learned that he had grown up in Tennessee and come west at 18 with his father, who had staked the original land claim here before dying of a rattlesnake bite when Stephen was 22. She learned that his wife, Helen, had died in childbirth 4 years ago, along with the baby, and that this was a grief that lived in him the way some griefs do, quietly in the background, surfacing only occasionally in the set of his jaw when something unexpected reminded him of it. She learned that he was a fair man with his hands and his ranch hands, both of whom were Tejano men named Eduardo and Luis, brothers-in-law from a family that had been in this part of Texas longer than any Anglo settler. He paid them properly and spoke to them with the plain respect of a man who understood that the land they worked had another history before his ownership of it. And while he never articulated this directly, Martha could see it in how he conducted himself, and it mattered to her. She learned that he read. There was a small shelf of books in the main room, a Bible, a battered almanac, 2 novels she did not recognize, and a volume of poetry by Alfred Tennyson that she would not have predicted for a cattle rancher in South Texas. When she took it down one evening to look at it, he came in from outside and saw her holding it and said, "My mother sent that. She's in Tennessee still. I've never read all of it." "I have," Martha said, a little surprised at herself. He looked at her steadily. "Did you like it?" "Parts of it. The part about loss is true," she said, and then she put the book back on the shelf because she was not sure where that sentence had come from. October moved toward November, and the mornings got cold enough to see your breath in the kitchen before the fire was built up. Martha settled into the rhythms of the ranch with a naturalness that surprised her, because she had not known how she would feel about Texas, about this particular place, about all of it. What she found was that she liked the open quality of the land, the way the sky was involved in everything, the smell of cedar and grass and livestock that was just a part of the air here, not something separate. She liked Rosa's company on the days she came, the way they worked in companionable parallel in the kitchen, Rosa occasionally teaching her something about the local cooking, the dried chilies, and the particular way of seasoning beans, Martha occasionally contributing something from her own repertoire that made Rosa nod with approval. She liked Stephen's steadiness. She had not expected to like it so quickly. She had expected to find it adequate, practical, the reliable quality of a man running an operation and needing someone competent to run the house. But steadiness in a person is a thing you feel, not just observe, and what she felt around Stephen Reed was a kind of solidity, as if the ground under her feet was reliable in a way it had not been for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like. She was careful with herself about this. She was 28 years old and she had been a widow for 8 months, and she was living on this man's ranch under what was still, technically, an employment arrangement, and she was not going to mistake gratitude and relief for something more complicated. She told herself this firmly and regularly, usually at night when she was lying in the dark listening to the Texas wind and thinking about the careful, unhurried way he had shown Samuel how to hold the reins. The complication arrived on a Tuesday in November when the first norther of the season came down without much warning. Martha was in the kitchen garden collecting the last of the dried herbs from the frames when the wind changed, going from the south to the north in the span of about 20 minutes, with a temperature drop that was startling even for someone who had lived through Kansas winters. She gathered what she had and went inside, and it was only when she called up the stairs for the children that she realized Eliza and Samuel were not in the house. She went to the window and looked toward the barn. The sky to the north had gone the color of pewter, low and fast-moving. She pulled her coat on and went out, and Eduardo was crossing the yard from the direction of the creek pasture at a near run, calling to her. "The children went to the south field," he said, "to see the cattle." Mr. Reed went after them when he saw the sky. Martha looked at the south field, which was a quarter-mile down a low slope, and the clouds were moving with a speed that made her stomach tighten. She was already walking, then running, because 3 weeks ago she had sewn their names into their coats against exactly this kind of fear, and the fear was here now, specific and immediate. She got to the top of the slope and saw them below, Stephen with one hand on Eliza's shoulder and the other holding Clara, Samuel pressed close to his side, all of them moving up the slope at a fast walk. And when Stephen saw her at the top, he raised a hand to show her they were there. They were coming, everyone accounted for. She stood there in the rising wind and watched them come up the hill toward her, and the relief was so large it made her dizzy. Stephen handed Clara up to her, and Clara immediately wrapped her arms around Martha's neck with the grip of a child who has been told to stay calm and has held it in until this moment. Stephen had his hand on Samuel's back, and Eliza was holding the hem of Martha's coat, and all five of them went back to the house together in the first flurries of the storm, and Stephen held the door and they all tumbled inside. The norther blew through for 2 days. The ranch was warm, well-stocked, and the children treated the confinement as something between an adventure and an imposition, cycling between the two with the speed typical of their ages. On the first evening, when the wind was singing high and flat against the window glass and the fire in the main room had been built up properly, Martha found Stephen in his chair with one of the novels open, a habit she had begun to recognize, and she said, without quite planning it, "Can I sit?" He looked up, nodded toward the other chair. She sat, and she brought her mending with her because she could not sit idle, and for a while neither of them said anything, just the fire and the wind and Clara's even breathing from the corner of the settle where she had fallen asleep with a blanket half over her. "Were you afraid today?" he asked eventually, not prying, just asking. "Yes," she said honestly. "I should have noticed the sky sooner, that's on me." "They shouldn't have gone to the south field without telling me," Martha said. "That's on me." He was quiet for a moment. "We could split the responsibility," he said. She looked up from her mending and found him watching her with that particular directness he had, the kind that did not demand anything but also did not pretend. "All right," she said. It was not a grand declaration. It was just an exchange of 8 words in front of a fire, while a norther blew outside and a 4-year-old slept in the corner. But Martha felt it settle into her like something finding its proper place, and she went back to her mending. And when she looked up again 20 minutes later, he was reading, and the scene was so ordinary and so entirely unlike anything that had been ordinary to her for the past terrible year that she had to look back at her mending quickly to compose herself. November passed, and December came in cold and clear the way Texas Decembers do sometimes, with hard white frosts at night and afternoons that were almost warm if you found a spot out of the wind. Martha had by now established such a thorough routine in the house that it ran nearly without thinking, and she found herself with actual free hours in the afternoons, something she had not had since well before Daniel died. She used them to walk, not far, and she told the children where she was going, and she always had an eye on the sky, but she walked the near pastures and the cedar breaks and the creek bank, learning the property the way she had learned him, in small pieces and over time. He found her one afternoon at the creek, sitting on a flat limestone ledge above the water, which was low and clear with the cold. He did not appear startled to find her there, and she was not startled to see him, which perhaps said something about how comfortable they had become with each other's proximity. He sat on the rock a few feet away and looked at the water for a moment and then said, "Eliza told me you used to teach." Martha looked at him. "She told you that? She mentioned it. She said you taught her to read and you taught Samuel, and you used to help other women's children in the boarding house in Abilene when you had time." Martha was quiet for a moment. "I went 2 years to the female seminary in Ohio. Before I married Daniel, I thought I would teach." She paused. "Life arranged differently." "Do you miss it?" She considered that honestly. "I miss the purpose of it," she said. "The feeling that you're putting something into someone that will last." Stephen was quiet for a moment. "There are children on 3 other ranches in 10 miles of here who don't get to Colton Creek for school in the winter months," he said. "Roads get bad weather." He paused. "I've a room in the house I don't use. If you wanted, it would be a start." Martha stared at him. "You're offering me a schoolroom." "I'm offering you a room and the thought," he said carefully. "What you do with it is your business." She looked back at the creek for a long moment because she needed somewhere to put her eyes while she understood how much that offer meant to her, how precisely he had seen something she had not even fully admitted to herself that she wanted. "I would need a proper blackboard," she said, because practicality was her armor and also her nature. "Chalk, some primers. The trading post in Colton Creek can order them from San Antonio," he said. I'll speak to Hatch about the next supply run." She looked at him sideways. He was watching the creek with the expression of a man who has said a thing and has no intention of making more of it than it is, but the tips of his ears were slightly red, which she did not think was entirely from the cold. "Thank you, Mr. Reed," she said. "Stephen," he said, not looking at her. "You've been here 2 months." "Stephen," she said, and his name in her mouth felt different than she had expected it to, not formal and careful the way it had been when she first used it. Warmer, more her own. December settled around them, and something settled between them at roughly the same time. Some unspoken acknowledgement that this was not simply a housekeeper's arrangement anymore, that the lines had blurred in the way that lines between people sometimes do when they have shared northern storms and creekside conversations, and the daily unremarkable intimacy of meals and laughter and children's bedtimes. Rosa noticed. Rosa noticed everything. She said to Martha one morning in Spanish, and then seeing Martha's expression in careful English, "He is not a man who gives attention easily. He does not waste it." Martha was rolling biscuit dough, and she kept her eyes on it. "We have an arrangement," she said. Rosa made a sound that was not quite agreement. 2 days before Christmas, a letter arrived from Mrs. Addie Crane at the Women's Placement Bureau in Abilene. It was addressed to Martha, and it was brief and direct in the manner of Mrs. Crane. It noted that as far as the Bureau was concerned, the placement had been made and Martha's situation was now her own affair. It also mentioned, with a neutrality that Martha recognized as something more charged than neutral, that the Bureau had received an inquiry from a Mr. Gordon Fisk of Abilene, who was attempting to locate a Martha Lockhart and her 3 children, claiming a creditor's interest in the estate of Daniel Lockhart, deceased. Martha read the letter twice. Then she folded it and stood very still for a moment over the kitchen table. Daniel had had a debt. She had known about it, had been dealing with it from the edges. A note owed to Gordon Fisk, who ran a lending operation in Abilene, from when Daniel had borrowed money to buy seed and equipment during a bad spring 2 years before he died. The amount had been $40 and some amount of accumulated interest. Martha had paid 11 of it back before Daniel died, had paid 7 more in the horrible months after, and then had stopped being able to pay because there was nothing left. Gordon Fisk was not a man of charity. He was a man of the law, or at least the version of the law that served his interests, and Martha knew that if he had tracked her here he was not coming to wish her well. She told Stephen that evening after the children were in bed. She did it at the kitchen table, the same way she did everything significant, plainly and without ornamentation, because she had found that was the only way she could stand behind her own words. She told him about the debt, the amount, the circumstances, Gordon Fisk. She told him that she had not mentioned it before because it was her trouble, not his, and she had believed she could manage it at a remove. Stephen listened without interrupting. He had his coffee cup in his hands and he held it and looked at the surface of the coffee, and when she finished he said, "How much does he claim you owe?" "Somewhere near $30 with the interest he's calculated." "I don't have $30. Stephen nodded slowly. "How does he intend to pursue it?" "I don't know exactly, but Gordon Fisk pursues things through whatever means inconveniences the other party most," she said. "I've seen him do it to other people." Stephen set his cup down. He looked at her directly. "Martha." It was the first time he had used her Christian name without the Mrs. in front of it, and the directness of it made her look up. "This is resolvable," he said. $30 is not nothing, but it's not beyond managing. I'm not going to let a man from Abilene reach onto this property and cause you harm over a creditor's debt that you've already paid half of." She shook her head. "This isn't your trouble. You're on this ranch," he said steadily. "What touches you touches this household. That makes it my concern." She opened her mouth and then closed it because she could hear in his voice that arguing would not move him, and also because some part of her that she had been very carefully managing for weeks was responding to the plain certainty in his face in a way that she was not prepared to examine at the kitchen table. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He wrote to Mrs. Crane the next morning and threw her to Gordon Fisk, indicating that any creditor's claims against the estate of Daniel Lockhart, whose widow was employed on the Reed Ranch in Colton Creek, Texas, should be directed to his legal attention through the Denton County Courthouse, and that he was prepared to settle the remaining principal of the debt in full as an advance against salary, which would be repaid by Mrs. Lockhart at no interest over the following 12 months. It was businesslike and clear, and it put a wall between Martha and Gordon Fisk that the man would understand. Fisk was not a fool. He would not spend money pursuing legal action in a Texas county over $30 when the debt was going to be settled cleanly. The response came in 3 weeks, a curt acknowledgement that the debt would be considered discharged upon receipt of the funds. Martha went to find Stephen in the barn when she read it, and she stood in the barn door with the letter in her hand and said, "He's going to accept the settlement." Stephen was checking the shoe on the chestnut mare's near foreleg, and he looked up at her from his crouch with a calm that she found infuriating and incredibly reassuring in equal measure. "Good," he said. "I will pay you back, every dollar." He stood. He was looking at her with an expression she had learned to identify over the past weeks, the one where he was thinking about saying something more than he was saying. "I know you will," he said. "You don't need to convince me of that." She stood there for a moment in the barn door with the winter light coming in at a low angle and the smell of hay and horses all around, and she said, because something had to be said, "Why do you do this?" "Do what?" "This." She gestured, a small helpless gesture that meant all of it: the room for the children, the schoolroom, the debt, the way he had led her children up the hill in a norther as if it were simply the obvious thing. "Why do you do all of this?" He was quiet for a moment. He had the habit of looking at a point just past her when he was working through something he wanted to say correctly, and she had learned to wait for it. "I was alone here for 4 years," he said. "After Helen, I ran the ranch and I did what needed doing and I got through each year. But alone is a particular kind of cold that you can get used to, and I don't think getting used to it is the same as being all right." He paused. "And then you got off that wagon with 3 children in coats with their names sewn inside them," and he stopped. "And," she said very quietly. "And I thought," he said carefully, "that a woman who does that for her children, that kind of thinking ahead, that kind of love that plans for the worst so that if the worst comes there's still a name to find them by, I thought that was someone worth knowing." Martha was looking at him directly, and her throat was tight and her hands were very still at her sides. "It was a practical measure," she said, because she needed to say something and that was what she had. "Martha," he said, and the way he said it was not argument. It was just her name and it had enough in it to fill the whole barn. She looked at the ground for a moment, then she looked up. "I am going to need time," she said. "I am not saying no. I am not saying I don't understand what you're telling me. I am saying I need time." "I know," he said. There was nothing impatient in him. "I've been here, I'll keep being here." Christmas that year at the Reed Ranch was unlike any Christmas Martha had prepared for, because she had not prepared for one with real resources since before Clara was born. And the combination of a stocked pantry and a kitchen that was genuinely large and a man who had ridden to the trading post 3 days before and come back with a bag of things that included a small paper of peppermint candy and a tin of proper tea, without being asked to produce in Martha a holiday that was more than she had allowed herself to hope for. She made a goose that Rosa had left instructions for, and 2 kinds of pie, and there was a small cedar tree that Samuel and Stephen had dragged in from the near break, and that Eliza and Clara had decorated with whatever was at hand, which turned out to be dried orange peels from the kitchen, a string of dried beans painted red, and some ribbon from Martha's sewing box. And when it was lit with 3 candles, it was not much to look at objectively. But subjectively, it was the most beautiful thing Martha had seen in longer than she could precisely measure. Stephen had gifts for the children. Not expensive things, a carved wooden horse for Clara that he had made himself from a piece of cedar, she realized when she turned it over and saw the careful knife marks. A real compass for Samuel with a proper brass case, the kind of boy who loved open land would covet. For Eliza, a small journal with a pencil, and Martha saw Eliza hold it for a long moment with an expression that said more about how deeply it was the right gift than any words could. For Martha he had nothing formal wrapped. But after the children were in bed, he came into the kitchen where she was finishing the last of the washing up and set something on the table beside her. It was a small box, cedar wood with a hinged lid. Inside, set in a piece of cloth, was a thimble, silver, with a small engraved band around the edge. She picked it up and looked at the engraving, a row of small leaves, simple and precise. "You work with your hands constantly," he said from behind her. "You should have a proper thimble." She turned around and he was close, closer than she had registered, and the kitchen was warm from the stove and the candle was burning low on the windowsill, and she looked up at him for a moment and then looked at the thimble in her palm and said, "It's the nicest thing anyone has given me in a long time." "That shouldn't be true," he said, very quietly. She looked up again. The space between them had not changed, but it felt different, charged in a way that made her very aware of her own breathing. She thought about what she had said in the barn, about needing time, and she thought about the 4 months that had accumulated between that October wagon and this Christmas kitchen, and she thought about the fact that she had been lonely for longer than 8 months, that she had been lonely in the particular way of a woman in a marriage that was good but not complete, and that what she felt standing in this kitchen was not lonely at all. She rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to the corner of his jaw, a brief soft thing, more of a promise than a kiss, and then she stepped back and looked at her hands. She heard him breathe out slowly. "I said I needed time," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think I may have overstated how much time I needed," she said. There was a pause, and then he said, with a warmth in his voice that she had not heard from him before, "Not quite. Is that so?" She looked up. He was watching her with those steady dark eyes and the expression of a man who is very carefully not moving, respecting the distance she had established, waiting for her to close it or not. She closed it. She took the one step and he met it, and he put his hand against the side of her face the way you touch something you've been afraid to touch, with a kind of careful astonishment, and when he kissed her it was not hasty or uncertain. It was deliberate. The way everything about him was deliberate, as if he had been thinking about this for quite some time and intended to do it properly. Martha had been 22 the last time someone had kissed her like she was worth a man's full attention, and she had forgotten how large that feeling was, how it occupied every part of you all at once. She had her hand against his chest and she could feel his heartbeat, which was not as steady as the rest of him suggested, and that undid her slightly more. When they separated, she had her forehead against his shoulder for a moment, and his hand was in her hair, and neither of them spoke for a considerable while. "I should go to bed," she said eventually. "The children will be up very early." "They will," he agreed, and there was a smile in his voice now, open and unguarded, and she heard it and felt it move through her like warm water. She took her candle and went down the hall, and she stood in the door of her room for a moment before going in, listening to the ranch house breathe around her, the tick of the wood in the walls, the distant sound of cattle, the low moan of the wind around the eaves, and she thought that this place sounded, for the first time, like somewhere she was supposed to be. January brought cold that was more serious, the kind that cracked the water in the buckets by morning, and kept the cattle grouped in the lower pastures where they had more shelter. Stephen and Eduardo and Louis worked long days through it, and Martha ran the house and began her small school in the spare room, which now had a proper blackboard ordered from San Antonio and 3 benches that Eduardo had built from spare cedar, rough-hewn but solid. On the first school day, 6 children came. Eliza and Samuel, 2 children from the Vasquez ranch 3 miles east whose mother brought them by wagon and stayed to watch for an hour with an expression of quiet gratitude, and 2 more from a ranch to the north, a boy of 9 and his younger sister. Martha stood at the blackboard with chalk in her hand and looked at them, 6 upturned faces in various states of enthusiasm and wariness, and felt something unlock in her chest that had been closed for years. It was small. It was 6 children in a spare room on a cattle ranch in South Texas, but it was hers, and it was real. Stephen appeared in the doorway at the end of the first session with his hat in his hands and looked at the room and at Martha at the board, and at the children packing up their things, and the expression on his face was the one she had come to think of as his private one, the one he did not always know he was wearing. He had it now, and he was directing it at her, and she held his gaze across the room for a moment and felt the warmth of it all the way to her feet. February arrived, and with it a quiet that had its own quality. The worst of the cold was past, but the work of the ranch was still the bone-deep winter kind, and the evenings were long. Stephen and Martha had developed the habit of sitting together after the children were in bed, sometimes reading, sometimes talking about the ranch's needs or the school, or what letters had come from her people in Ohio, or his mother in Tennessee. It was easy in the way that things are easy when the fit is right, not effortless, because nothing real is effortless but natural, the way breathing is natural. He told her about Helen slowly, over several evenings, not all at once. He told her about a woman who had been brave and laughed easily, and who had wanted children badly, and about the night in the winter 4 years ago when it had gone wrong, when the doctor could not be reached in time, and there had been nothing Stephen could do but hold her hand and watch the light go out of her. He told it without self-pity and without over-embellishment, in the plain, careful way he told most things, and Martha listened with her mending in her lap and her heart wide open. She would have liked you, he said. She liked people who were honest. Martha was quiet for a moment. I think about Daniel sometimes, and I wonder if I did enough for him, she said. If I was enough. What does enough mean? If I loved him well, she said. He was a good man. He tried hard. But I think there was something between us that was more loyalty than more than this, Stephen said, and his voice was gentle, not presumptuous, just honest. She looked up. He was watching her with the patient attention she had come to rely on, that quality of being fully present when she spoke, not waiting for his turn but actually listening. More than this, she agreed. He reached across the space between the chairs and put his hand over hers, and they sat like that in the firelight, and it was one of those moments that does not need amplifying because its own simplicity is more than enough. He asked her to marry him in March. It was not dramatic. They were walking the south field on a warm afternoon, checking the fence line after a section of it had been found damaged by what Eduardo believed was a young bull testing his limits, and the children were back at the house with Rosa, and the afternoon had that particular still gold quality that Texas afternoons in March sometimes have, where the light is liquid and everything looks slightly more beautiful than usual. He stopped walking. She stopped because he did. He said, "Martha, I would like you to be my wife, if you are willing." She looked at him, at the earnest directness of him, at the way he had his hat in his hand even though they were standing in an open field and the sun was on his hair, and she thought about October on a wagon with 3 children in named coats and a folded paper with an address on it, and the particular terror of beginning something so completely unknown. She said, "My children come with me. That is not a condition I can soften." "I know that," he said. "I am asking you to marry me, Martha. Not you minus the children, all of you." There it was again, that word, all. She had been saying the word yes in her mind for several weeks. She had just been making certain it was the right yes and not a tired yes or a grateful yes or a frightened yes. She had taken her time with it because she had promised herself after Daniel that if she ever stood at another threshold she would know clearly which side of it she wanted to be on. She was clear. "Yes," she said. "Stephen, yes." He exhaled slowly, the breath of a man who has been holding something tightly. Then he took her hand in both of his, the rough-palmed hands of a man who worked hard and took care with what mattered, and he held it, and she let him, and they stood in the south field in the March gold afternoon, and the distance between where they had started and where they were now was the whole of what either of them had needed to live through to arrive here. They were married in April by the minister who came through Colton Creek once a month, a thin and earnest man named Reverend Boone, who performed the ceremony in the main room of the ranch house, because the weather that week was uncertain, and Martha had decided she preferred the house anyway. Rosa and Eduardo and Luis were there. Mrs. Gutierrez from the Vasquez Ranch, who had been sending her children to Martha's school and who had become, quietly, a friend. Hatch, the liveryman who had driven the wagon from Denton on that October afternoon. A handful of other people from the near ranches who had been Stephen's neighbors through good years and difficult ones. Eliza stood beside Martha in a dress that Martha had made from a length of deep blue calico, and she was solemn and careful the way Eliza was about everything, but her eyes were bright. Samuel stood beside Stephen, having appointed himself to this role without being asked, his collar buttoned and his hair combed with such thoroughness that Martha suspected Stephen had had a hand in it. Clara wore her coat, the brown wool one with her name sewn inside the collar, because she wanted to, and Martha did not argue because some things are worth keeping. When Reverend Boone got to the part about who would speak against this union and the room stayed silent, Martha felt the silence like a physical thing, warm and complete. When Stephen said "I do," he said it the way he said everything important, without decoration, looking at her directly, meaning every syllable. She said "I do," and it came out steadier than she had expected and more full of feeling than she had planned to show. And Stephen's expression did the thing it had been doing since March, that open, unguarded thing, and she was very glad. He kissed her in front of all of them in that uncomplicated way he had, his hand against her face, and there was a sound from the assembled company that was equal parts warmth and approval, and Clara said audibly, "Now can we have cake?" which broke the whole room open in laughter. The summer of 1874 established itself over the ranch in long golden days, and the work of it was hard and constant, and satisfying in the way that work is when it is yours in a way that matters. Martha had her school, which by summer had 7 regular students, and which she was already thinking of ways to expand come fall. She had her kitchen and her kitchen garden, which she had built up considerably with the help of Rosa, and a packet of vegetable seeds ordered from a catalog out of San Antonio. She had her evenings with Stephen, and the easy warmth of the life they had built together, and the children, who were growing in the particular wild-grass way of children with space and good food and adults who paid attention to them. Samuel had become what could only be described as a horseman. Stephen had been giving him real lessons on Cora through the winter and into spring, and by summer the boy could handle the mare with a confidence that made Martha's heart simultaneously proud and alarmed, because confidence in an 8-year-old on a horse has its own specific risks. But Stephen was careful with him, and Samuel was becoming, under that care, the kind of boy who looked at things before acting, who considered, and Martha recognized in that development the particular gift of a good man's influence and felt it keenly. Eliza had begun writing, not just in her journal but seriously, filling pages in her careful hand, the beginnings of stories and descriptions of the land and small observations that Martha sometimes read over her daughter's shoulder, with the quiet astonishment of recognizing something in your child that came not from you, but from the child herself. Stephen had ordered a second journal for her from the San Antonio catalog without being asked, which had made Eliza look at him for a moment with the particular expression she reserved for things she was moved by, a brief, complete exposure before the composure came back. Clara was 5 now and had opinions about everything. She had decided by June that she was Stephen's, in some territorial way that she could not quite articulate but that manifested in always sitting next to him at supper, always bringing him things she found interesting, a feather, a smooth rock from the creek, a beetle she had caught in a jar, and always beginning any address to him with the word Papa, which she had simply started using one day in April without any announcement, and with an absolute certainty that made argument not only unnecessary but somehow beside the point. The first time Martha heard it, she had been in the kitchen and Stephen had been on the porch, and Clara had come tearing around the corner of the house with some urgent news about the condition of the near creek, and had said, "Papa, come and see." And Martha had stood still with her hands in the dishwater and felt something move through her that was so large and so specific that she had to breathe against it. She went to the door and looked at Stephen on the porch with Clara pulling his hand, and he was looking back at her over Clara's head with an expression that held a question and a kind of wonder and also a steadiness that said whatever she decided about it, he was there. She had nodded. Just once, a small clear nod. His expression had done that thing again, the open, unguarded warmth of it, and then he had let Clara drag him toward the creek. Eliza and Samuel came to it more slowly and with more consideration, which was appropriate to who they were. Eliza, one evening in July, in the particular privacy of passing him the salt at supper, called him Stephen, not Mr. Reed, for the first time, and the weight of the name change was perceptible to everyone at the table, though no one commented. Samuel, who approached most things at a slight diagonal, started asking Stephen for his opinion on things, on the fence repair and the best grazing route, and which of the young horses had the most promise, and this asking was its own kind of claiming. Martha and Stephen had the large bedroom now, the one that had been his, with the east window and the quilt that she had come to understand had been made by Helen, and that Stephen had offered to put away, and Martha had said leave it, because she was not afraid of the past, and she did not believe in erasing what had come before. She told him that in the dark one night in late summer, his arm around her and the ranch quiet outside, "I'm not afraid of your grief," she said. "I have my own, that's not a problem." "No," he said, his chin on the top of her head, "it isn't. But I want you to know," she said, "that what I feel for you is not a substitute for anything. It's its own thing, it's completely itself." He was quiet for a moment. "Martha," he said. "What?" "I know," he said. "I know that." In late August, Martha realized she was expecting. She sat with it for 2 weeks before she told Stephen, partly to be certain, partly because she needed to settle the feeling of it herself before she could put it into words. The feeling was complicated, not because she did not want the baby, but because of the last time she had been in this state, the cheerful, uncomplicated Kansas pregnancy with Daniel that had given her Clara, and the time before that with Samuel, and she needed to separate those memories from this new one and understand where she stood. Where she stood was, she wanted this. She wanted it with a warmth and certainty that surprised her with its uncomplicated simplicity, given how unsimple everything else had been. She told him on the porch on a Sunday evening after the children were in bed, sitting in the rocking chairs with the night coming down over the cedar and the creek sound carrying up from the low ground. She said it plainly, the way she said things. "I believe I am expecting a child." He stopped rocking. He turned his head and looked at her fully. The expression on his face was one she had not seen before, a kind of raw, unfiltered joy that had something trembling at its edges, and she understood that it was trembling because of the last time, because of 4 years ago, and she reached over and put her hand on his arm. "I am healthy," she said. "I have done this 3 times. I will tell you if anything concerns me, I promise." He put his hand over hers. His was not entirely steady. "I know," he said. "I know that. Stephen," he looked at her. "This is good news," she said firmly. He breathed out slowly. Then he turned her hand over and held it in both of his, and the expression on his face settled into something she could only call profound happiness, the kind that has gone through something real to get to itself and is the stronger for it. "Yes," he said. "It is." Fall came around again, the 2nd October on the ranch, and this one was entirely different from the first. The kitchen had the warm smell of the drying herbs and the apple preserves that Martha had put up from the small orchard behind the barn, and the school had 8 students now, and Martha had written to Mrs. Crane at the bureau in Abilene to inquire about the possibility of obtaining a proper curriculum from one of the Ohio normal schools. because she was serious about this, and intended to stay serious about it. The school days were now her mornings, and the ranch management was her afternoons, and her evenings were Stephen's, and the whole shape of the life fit her the way a well-made coat fits. She found herself one afternoon in October, the anniversary of her arrival, standing at the bedroom window looking at the yard below where Samuel was on Cora's back executing a proper figure 8 around 2 fence posts he had set up himself, with Stephen watching from the rail of the paddock, and nodding when it was right, and not nodding when it wasn't. And Clara was beside Stephen on the rail with her boots hooked on the second board talking in his ear about something with great enthusiasm. And Eliza was on the porch writing in her journal, her hair in 2 braids and her face entirely absorbed. Martha put her hand on the slight curve of her belly, not yet visible under her dress but present, known, real. She thought about October of last year, the boarding house in Abilene with its drafty walls, the $22, the 3 coats on the chair by the door with the names sewn inside. She thought about the particular kind of love that plans for the worst so that if the worst comes, there is still a name to find them by. She thought about a man who had read those names and said simply that he had room for all of them. She thought about the distance between that cold Kansas October and this warm Texas one, and how that distance was not just 4 months and 1,200 miles, but a whole life, hers, rebuilt from the ground up in a place she had not known existed, with a man she had not known she needed, and 3 children who had found their footing here the way children will when they are given the twin gifts of stability and being truly seen. Rosa appeared in the yard and called something in Spanish to Stephen, and he answered and laughed, a real laugh, the unconstrained kind that she heard more now than she had in the early months, and Clara fell off the fence rail in her enthusiasm to agree with whatever was being said, and Stephen caught her without even fully turning, just reached out and had her, and Clara shrieked with laughter. Martha pressed her hand flat on the window glass for a moment. "We are all right," she said quietly to herself, to Daniel, to the person she had been in that boarding house with the needle in her bleeding fingers. "We are all going to be all right." The winter passed around them with its demands and its satisfactions, and Martha grew steadily through it, her pregnancy uncomplicated and healthy, and Stephen was careful with her in the particular way of a man who has cause to be afraid, and has chosen not to be afraid but is careful anyway. He took nothing for granted and asked regularly, and listened when she told him what she needed. And the night in February when the pains started he rode to Colton Creek for the doctor himself, not sending Louis or Eduardo, but going himself at speed in the cold dark, because he was not going to be the man who sent someone else. The doctor, a capable man named Dr. Ferris, who had been in Colton Creek for 6 years, arrived with enough time to spare, and Rosa was there, and it was a hard 8 hours but an uncomplicated one in the medical sense. And at just past dawn on a February morning in 1875, Martha and Stephen Reed's son was born. He was large and red-faced and had an excellent voice and a quantity of dark hair that he had from his father, and when Stephen held him for the first time, standing by the bed where Martha lay exhausted and wholly present, the expression on his face was what she had seen in August on the porch when she had told him, but fully arrived now, fully realized, with none of the trembling in it. "He's here," Stephen said. "He is entirely here," Martha said. They named him Daniel James Reed. Daniel for the man who had been good and tried hard and had given Martha Samuel and Eliza and Clara. James for Stephen's father who had staked this land. Reed because this was what they were now, all of them, the family that had been assembled out of grief and courage and necessity, and had become, over 14 months of shared meals and northern storms and creek bank conversations, and a cedar tree decorated with dried orange peels, something that was entirely and completely real. Samuel, when he was brought in to meet his new brother, looked at the baby in Martha's arms for a long moment with great seriousness and then said, "He looks annoyed." Eliza said, "He is a newborn, Samuel. "They all look like that," Clara said. "His name is in his coat," very firmly, as if this were the critical matter. Stephen had, in fact, already stitched the baby's name into the small white gown he'd be wrapped in for the next weeks, because when Martha had told him about the coats and why she had done it, he had understood completely and had said that they would continue the practice. All of them. Everyone on this ranch would know their name by name. Spring came again, the second spring and then the third, and the school grew to 12 students, and Martha wrote to the county about official recognition and was told, with the particular bureaucratic hedging of a territorial government still finding its feet, that informal schools on private property were not unusual and not prohibited, but also not formally funded, but that if she continued operating and keeping proper rolls. There was a discussion underway in Austin about district funding for rural schools that might change the situation. Martha filed her rolls and kept teaching and wrote a letter to Austin herself, in her clear, direct hand, outlining the educational need in the Colton Creek area, which she suspected would not be read by anyone important but which she felt compelled to write anyway. The ranch expanded. Stephen purchased an additional 300 acres along the creek to the south from a family moving north, and with Eduardo and Louis, and now a third hand named Thomas, a young man from Galveston who had come looking for work and proved competent and reliable, the operation grew to the point where Stephen needed to think about a second structure, a larger barn and a small bunkhouse for the hands. Martha sat with him at the kitchen table on many evenings over those months, going over the accounts with the facility of a woman who was genuinely good with numbers, and who had found in ranch bookkeeping the same satisfaction she found in teaching, the pleasure of a system that could be made to make sense if you were attentive and careful with it. He told her one evening, when she had found a calculation error in the feed accounts that had been compounding for 6 weeks, that she was the finest mind on this ranch by some distance. She had looked up from the ledger with her pencil in her hand and said, "That cannot be true. Eduardo has forgotten more about cattle than either of us will ever know." Stephen had said, "Eduardo would agree with me." She had thrown a biscuit at him, which was a thing she would not have predicted herself capable of when she had arrived with her carpetbag and her 3 named children, but which felt entirely natural now, and which made him laugh the open, unguarded laugh, and which made Daniel, who was by then 8 months old and in the basket by the stove, look up with enormous dark eyes at the sound of his father laughing. Eliza turned 13 in the summer of 1876, and she was a different creature than the serious 10-year-old who had arrived with Aesop's fables in her bag, not less serious but more expanded, as if the Texas land had given her room to grow in directions she hadn't had space for in Kansas. She was still protective of Clara and still watchful in the way she had always been, but she had humor now that came out in dry, precise observations that made Rosa laugh and frequently made Stephen and Martha exchange a look over her head that said, "Where did she come from?" She had been writing a continuous account of the ranch and its people and the land, not a diary exactly, more a document, and that summer she showed it to Martha, all 32 pages of it, written in her careful hand in 3 of the journals Stephen had ordered for her, and Martha had read it and then had to excuse herself to the bedroom for a few minutes because what she felt was too large for the kitchen. The writing was extraordinary. Not perfect, Eliza was 13, but it had the quality of someone who saw truly, who noticed the angle of light on the cedar at 5 in the afternoon, and the way Stephen's shoulders changed when he was worried about weather versus just thinking, and the particular laugh Samuel had when he was pretending not to care about something, and the smell of the house in winter with the fire built up, and the cinnamon from the kitchen and the cedar outside. She had written about the journey from Abilene with a precision and a feeling that made Martha ache. She had written about her father Daniel with fairness and love. She had written about Stephen with the particular care of someone who has had to decide whether to give their heart to something and has made the decision and is describing the result. Martha showed it to Stephen that night after Eliza was in bed, without asking Eliza's permission first, which was a small violation she was prepared to justify later if necessary. She watched him read it at the kitchen table, and she watched his face change page by page, and when he set the last page down he was quiet for a long time. "She's going to need proper schooling," he said finally, "beyond what you can give her here." "I know," Martha said. "I've been thinking about San Antonio. There is a female academy there." "I'll write and find out the terms," he said. "She should have what she's capable of." Martha put her hand over his on the table. He turned it over and held it, the familiar gesture, and she looked at him and thought, "Here is the man I chose and who chose me, and this is the whole of what that means. This is what it looks like from the inside, and it looks like this, exactly this." The years moved. Daniel learned to walk and then to run and never quite stopped running. A perpetual motion child who had his mother's practicality and his father's steadiness, and some quality entirely his own that manifested as an absolute inability to ignore any interesting thing in his path, which on a working cattle ranch was everything. Samuel at 14 had become something close to Stephen's right hand on the horsework, a boy of genuine skill and growing judgment, who had started asking questions about the business of ranching that showed he was thinking past the immediate and into the long view. Clara, who had always been definite, became more so with age, and at 7 she was conducting the younger children of the various families who came for school with a supervisory authority that her mother found both amusing and entirely recognizable. Eliza went to San Antonio for school in the fall of 1877, 14 years old, her journal and her pencils in her carefully packed trunk. And the morning she left, Martha held her at the wagon for a long time, and Eliza, who was composed about most things, was not composed about this, and pressed her face against Martha's shoulder the way she had when she was very small, and Martha stroked her hair and said quietly, "You are going to be extraordinary. You already are." Eliza pulled back and looked at her with eyes that were her father's and her character's and entirely her own. "Will you write? Every week," Martha said. "Both of us." Eliza turned to Stephen, who had been standing a step back giving them their moment, and she looked at him for a second, and then she stepped forward and put her arms around him, not with Clara's fierce claiming, but with the deliberate choice of someone who has decided this is what they mean and want to express it clearly. He held her and said something quietly against the top of her head that Martha could not hear, and Eliza nodded against his chest. And then the wagon was waiting, and Eliza climbed in, composed again, her chin up, her braid over her shoulder, and she rode south towards San Antonio and her life. Martha wrote every week without fail. Stephen wrote too, his careful cramped handwriting with its chosen words, letters that included the ranch news and Samuel's progress and Daniel's latest adventure, and once a very long, careful paragraph about the cattle market that had clearly been written because he didn't know how else to say that he missed her at supper. Eliza wrote back in long, full letters that were already, at 14, the writing of someone with a real gift. In the spring of 1878, Martha found herself expecting again, which she told Stephen on the porch in the same evening light as before, different season but the same quality of gold, and his face did the same thing it had done the first time, moved through its complication to its resolution, and he brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to her fingers and said, "Again." "Again," she confirmed. "Good," he said simply, and she felt the word the whole length of her. This time was a daughter. Born in October of 1878, small and red and entirely healthy, with Martha's coloring and what Rosa declared was Stephen's expression. They named her Rose Helen Reed, Rose for Rosa Gutierrez, who had become one of the most important people in this family's life and who wept openly when she heard the name, and Helen for the woman Stephen had loved and lost who deserved to be remembered. Stephen held baby Rose in the lamplight the evening after her birth, and Martha watched from the bed, tired and well, and thought about the threading of things, how grief and love are not opposites, How a life can hold both at once without one diminishing the other. How Helen's name in this child was not a monument to loss, but an acknowledgement that all of it, the grief and the love and the arriving and the enduring, was part of the same continuous thing. The ranch in those years was a place that had become itself, not just Stephen's land or Martha's work or the children's childhood, but a genuine living entity made up of all of them together. Eduardo and Luis were still there. Eduardo's youngest son now working alongside his father, learning the cattle work the way Samuel had learned the horse work, with someone patient and skilled showing him how. Thomas from Galveston had married a woman named Ida who had come to Colton Creek the previous year, and they lived in the small house that had been the bunkhouse, now expanded. Rosa came 4 days a week now and had begun, with an expertise that Martha appreciated deeply, teaching Clara everything she knew about the kitchen, which Clara was taking in with the focus of a born cook. The school had grown to 15 students, and Martha had written 3 more times to Austin, and had finally received a letter indicating that the Colton Creek area was being included in the new district formation, and that the informal school at the Reed Ranch would be considered the provisional district school, pending an official visit from the county school board, which was to occur in the spring. Martha had written back a letter of 4 pages outlining the school's operation, student roles, curriculum, and resource needs, which Stephen had read over her shoulder and said, "This is going to either impress them completely or terrify them." "I intended to do both," Martha had said. The school board visited in April of 1879. 3 men in a wagon from the county seat, formal and somewhat uncertain about the distance they had traveled, who arrived to find a spare room that had become a proper classroom, 15 children ranging in age from 6 to 13, a blackboard covered in arithmetic, a bookshelf with actual primers and a collected reader, and a teacher who could answer every question they had with clarity and documentation. They recognized the school officially before the end of summer. Martha stood on the porch the evening the letter came and read it, and then called for Stephen, who came from the direction of the barn with his hat pushed back on his head and his expression inquiring, and she held the letter up and said, "It's official." He crossed the yard in a few long strides and took the letter from her hand and read it, and then he looked up at her with that expression, the unguarded one, and said, "Martha." "Don't," she said, because she could feel her own face doing something unsteady. "I'm going to say it," he said. "Go on then," she said. "I am so proud of you," he said. "I have been proud of you since the first day." She put her forehead on his chest and let him put his arms around her, and they stood on the porch of the ranch house in the April evening with the cedar smell in the air, and the cattle sound in the distance, and the letter official in his hand, and the school real and recognized in the room inside the house, where it had started with 6 children on rough cedar benches. Eliza came home from San Antonio for the summer of 1879, 16 years old, and she was different in the way that a year of real education and exposure does to a person with a genuinely hungry mind, more expansive, more confident in the scope of her thinking, and still entirely herself. She brought 3 books and a letter of commendation from her teacher, and the news that she had been asked to write a piece for the school's publication, a small printed journal, on the subject of rural Texas life, which she intended to write about the ranch. She sat on the porch with Stephen the first evening and talked about ideas for it, asking him questions about the history of the land and the cattle operation and his years here, and he answered her fully, and with the care he always gave to things that mattered. And Martha sat in the doorway and listened to the 2 of them, and felt something that was not entirely nameable. The particular satisfaction of watching a child who is not your blood, but entirely your own becoming who she is supposed to be with the help of a man who never had to love her, but chose to, every day, in the unceremonious practical ways that real love is mostly made of. Samuel was 15 that summer, and had the height of Stephen and the seriousness of Eliza, and a laugh that was all his own, a sudden delighted thing that surprised you when it came. He had been talking to Stephen about the possibility of working the ranch full alongside the hands when he was older, had had that conversation with a maturity that Martha had marveled at, and Stephen had said the ranch would always have a place for him, and had meant it, and the conversation had settled something in Samuel that you could see in the straightness of his posture afterward, some need that had been answered. Clara at 10 was the authority of the kitchen and the schoolroom, the child who managed things. Daniel at 4 was incandescent and tireless. Rose at nearly 1 had just found her feet and was using them with the thoroughness of a person who has been waiting to walk for a very long time. The summer of 1879 was a good summer. The cattle market was strong, the rains were reasonable, the school was established, Eliza was home, and the evenings on the porch were long and warm. One evening in August late, after the children were in bed, Martha and Stephen sat in the rocking chairs with the Texas dark spread out before them and the stars enormous and close the way they are in South Texas away from any town, and Stephen said without preamble as he sometimes said things, "Are you happy?" Martha considered this for a moment, not because the answer was uncertain, but because she respected the question and wanted to give it a full answer. "I am more than happy," she said. "Happy is something you feel in a moment. What I feel is," she paused, looking for the right word, the precise one, because she was her daughter's mother after all and she valued precision. "Settled," she said, "not in the dull sense, in the way that a thing that has been uncertain for a long time and found its place feels, settled in myself, settled here." He was quiet for a moment in the companionable way that was one of the things she had come to love most about him, the way silence between them was never empty but full of the accumulated understanding of people who know each other truly. "I ask," he said, "because there are times when I look around at all of this and I don't quite believe it, and I want to be sure you know that I know how much you are the reason for it." She turned her head and looked at him, this man she had married out of necessity and found to be the great good luck of her life, with his hat on the rail and his hands easy in his lap and the starlight on his face. "Stephen," she said. "What?" "You read the names in those coats," she said. "You read them and you said you had room. That was the beginning of all of it." "You sewed them there," he said. "That was the beginning." She thought about that cold October morning in Abilene, the needle and the blood and the shaking hands. She thought about what had made her do it, not just practicality, not just the fear of separation, but the deeper thing underneath it, the absolute refusal to let her children disappear into a world that might otherwise have no name to call them by, the love that plans for the worst so that the worst cannot take everything. "I was terrified," she admitted, "of the journey, of all of it, of arriving here and having made the wrong decision. I sat up all night before we left and I couldn't sleep, and the only thing I could do was sew those names." "You didn't make the wrong decision," he said. "No," she agreed. "I did not." He reached over and took her hand the way he had reached over in that moment by the firelight in winter, the same gesture, unchanged by the years, and she held it and they rocked slowly in the August dark, and the cedar smell was in the warm air, and somewhere down by the creek a night bird was calling. She thought about the letter she had written to Mrs. Crane from Abilene, the plain statement of her circumstances and her capabilities. She thought about Stephen's careful handwriting and those 5 words, "That does not trouble him." She thought about the wagon from Denton on a dusty October road. She thought about a man crouching down to read the careful stitching in a 4-year-old's collar and looking up with something she had not yet had a name for. She had a name for it now. She had had a name for it for some time. It was the name of a man who sees you completely, who reads your love for your children in the work of your own hands, who makes room not for the version of you that is easier or simpler or without history and need, but for all of you, every piece, every name, every child. Rose made a sound from inside the house, the brief waking sound of a baby who is not fully distressed but making her presence known, and Martha moved to rise and Stephen said, "I'll go," and she let him, listening to his footsteps on the board floor inside, the creak of the door, and then his voice, low and unhurried, talking to his daughter in the dark, and Rose's sound subsiding into quiet. Martha rocked in the warm August night and listened to the ranch breathe around her, and she was, precisely and completely, home. The seasons continued to turn. Eliza returned to San Antonio for her final year of school and completed it with honors, and her piece about the ranch was published in the school journal and was reprinted, with her astonished permission, in the San Antonio Daily Express, a small piece tucked in the middle of the paper, but there, with her name on it. Eliza Lockhart, guest contributor, Colton Creek, Texas. She came home at 17 with her trunk and her books and the particular contained excitement of someone who has discovered the scope of what they are capable of, and she sat with Martha and Stephen and said she wanted to go further, wanted to study letters and writing properly, and there was a women's college in Ohio she had written to. Stephen and Martha looked at each other across the kitchen table. Martha said, "Tell us about the college." They sent her in the autumn of 1880. 17 and bright and ready, and the house felt different for her absence, larger and quieter in the specific way of a room where a particular kind of light has been. But she wrote long, wonderful letters, and she came home for summers, and the gap between what she had been and what she was becoming was one of the great privileges of Martha's life to witness. Samuel took a genuine role in the ranch operations when he turned 18 in 1882. Working full alongside Stephen and Eduardo, with a skill and instinct for the cattle work that made Stephen quietly proud in the way he was quiet about most things that moved him. He had grown into a measured, capable young man with Daniel Lockhart's honest brown eyes and something of Stephen's steadiness, and Martha sometimes looked at him and thought about the 8-year-old boy with one boot still on, who had not complained about the cold, because she had said there was a place waiting. Clara at 15 was the best cook on the ranch by anyone's admission, and had begun helping Martha with the younger schoolchildren on the mornings Rosa was there, with a patience and a humor that made her gifted with small children in the way of someone who has not been taught it but simply has it. Daniel at 7 was learning to read with the same furious intensity he brought to everything, and Rose at 5 was attending the school and was doing so with the focused seriousness of a child who has observed learning all her life and knows what it is for. Stephen turned 38 in the spring of 1882, and Martha made him a cake from the molasses recipe he had mentioned once, offhandedly, that his mother had made when he was small, and she had written to his mother in Tennessee for the recipe 3 weeks before. A letter his mother had answered with the recipe and 6 pages of warm, detailed writing about her son as a boy that Martha treasured. He ate the cake at the kitchen table surrounded by children of varying sizes and Rosa and Eduardo and Luis, who had all been invited to supper, and he looked around at all of it, at all of them, and then he looked at Martha across the table, and she saw in his face the thing she had first seen him, where when he had been looking at the stove, and had not quite known she was looking. It was the expression of a man who had decided to stop being surprised by his own happiness and simply live in it. She lifted her coffee cup slightly toward him, a small private toast, and he returned it, and Clara said, "What are you doing?" And they both said nothing at the same time, which made everyone laugh. On the occasion of their 10th wedding anniversary, in April of 1884, Stephen had a letter waiting for her on the kitchen table when she came downstairs, sealed with a blob of candle wax the way he sealed things of importance. She stood at the table and opened it, and inside was a single sheet in his cramped, careful hand. It said, "Martha, 10 years ago you stepped off a wagon in front of the Colton Creek trading post with 3 children and coats and names sewn into them like a woman who intended to be found. I have been found every day since. You have made this house a home, and this land a life, and these children a family. I am a man who does not say enough. I know that. Let this be the record that I know it, and that there is not a day I have not been grateful for the distance you traveled to get here, and the courage it took, and you, all of you. "You're Stephen." She folded it with great care and held it for a moment, and then she put it in the cedar box where she kept the important things, next to Daniel's pocket watch and the daguerreotype and the 22 letters tied with kitchen string, and she went to find her husband. He was on the porch in the morning sun, and when she came out he looked up, and she crossed the porch and put both arms around him from the side, her face against his shoulder, and he turned and held her properly, his chin on her hair, and the morning was gold and warm, and the cedar smell was in the air, and somewhere in the house Daniel and Rose were arguing cheerfully about something, and Clara's voice could be heard settling it with authority. "I love you," she said into his shoulder. "In case I do not say it enough either." She felt him breathe in, deep and slow, the breath of a man fully present in his life. "You say it every day," he said, "just not always with words." She leaned back and looked at him, this man who had read her children's names and said he had room, who had turned a housekeeper's arrangement into the largest and most complete love of her life, who had been patient and steady and capable of the kind of constant, unremarkable devotion that is the true substance of a life shared well. She thought, "I will remember this exact moment. The gold morning and the cedar and his arms and the children's voices inside and all the years behind us and all the years still ahead." "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." "We always have," he said, and he was smiling, and she was smiling, and the porch of the Reed Ranch in Colton Creek, Texas, on an April morning in 1884, held all of that and more, the whole accumulated weight and grace of it. Two people and the family they had made from grief and courage and names sewn into coats, standing in the sun of a life that was theirs, entirely and completely and for as long as they both lived.